Hello, my name is Prisma Garcia in your capacity with SVP Dallas. Today marks the 4th anniversary of the day, July 7th, 2016, when 4 police officers and 1 DART officers were killed in the line of duty. And we would like to honor them with memories, and our citizens in Dallas were changed forever that day. Thank you so much for joining this workshop. It's advocating for good during a crisis. Today we'll be discussing how advocacy can advance your organization's mission and collaborate with public and private partners to change and improve public policy. We have several panelists today: Hillary Evans, Susan Hoff, Natalie Ossenfort, and Dan Waldman joining us. If you're on social media today, if you could follow SVP Dallas, we will be posting about this event. And also, if you'd like to make your own post, you could also tag SVP Dallas, or you could use the hashtag SVPD Workshops. Special thanks to our sponsor, Something Good Consulting Group, for their support and their continued social responsibility in North Texas. We would like to kick off with some introductions from our panelists today. We have some SVP partners that will start off with some brief introductions. So I'll pass it on to Hoff.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Prisma. My name is Susan Hoff, and I am the Chief Strategy and Impact Officer at United Way of Metropolitan Dallas. Many of you may know, but United Way is a community impact organization, and we're committed to ensuring that every North Texas, regardless of race, place, or income, has the opportunity and access needed to achieve their full potential. We focus our efforts in the areas of education, income, and health, and we believe in the power of unity to drive lasting change across our community. Our key engagement actions are giving, advocating, and volunteering. So advocating today is a primary focus for United Way. Also, in addition to being an SVP partner, a long-term one, I serve on a number of boards and coalitions, collaborative efforts across the state, including Texans Care for Children, the Texas Education Grantmakers Advocacy Consortium, TGAC, Early Matters Dallas, Tex Protects, and Tex Post, each of which lead strong advocacy efforts here and across the state. So thank you for having me here today, and I will pass it to Hillary. Or to Dan, sorry. Pardon me.
Thank you, Susan. I'm Dan Waldman. I have been a social venture partner since 2013. Professionally, I am a consultant engaged in strategic communications, public affairs, government relations, and policy development, primarily in the healthcare sector, and working a lot in Washington, D.C., also in Austin. I actually am also involved in the community, much through social venture partners, but also I am in my 7th year as a trustee for the Dallas Theater Center, and actually started my term as president just this year. I also, along with Susan, am a member of the governing board of Early Matters Dallas, working in the area of early childhood education, among other things. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and I will turn it back over to Prisma.
Thank you, Susan and Dan. As always with these workshops, we are joined by organizations that are working hard in the community, and they are putting these, putting these into practice, right? Putting these conversations in action. And so today we also have with us Hillary Evans, who is the former Executive Director of After8toEducate and now with Philanthropy Southwest. And so we'll let her and Natalie Roetzel Ossenfort, who is the Director of the Texas Office of Alliance for Justice, just give their quick introductions.
Thank you, Prisma. Honored to be part of today's discussion, and just want to commend and thank SVP Dallas for organizing these important digital gatherings on such timely and relevant topics like the topic today. I truly believe that advocacy is everyone's business, particularly in times of crisis. advocacy has certainly been part of my life's work, particularly in my current role at Philanthropy Southwest, where I oversee the organization's professional learning and public policy efforts. And just a word or two about who we are. Philanthropy Southwest is the oldest, what we call philanthropy support organization in the country. We've been around for 72 years. And our members, SVP Dallas is actually a member, are 200 plus foundations, private corporate community foundations, representing 55 billion philanthropic assets in the Southwest. And our grant making spans across 7 states, including Arizona, Arkansas, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas. And as Prisma mentioned, prior to coming to Philanthropy Southwest, I served as the former Executive Director of After8toEducate, which is a backbone organization leading a public-private collaborative involving the Dallas Independent School District and other nonprofit organizations, including SVP Dallas and Promise House and City Square, to support homeless high school students here in Dallas. And this initiative was initially incubated within SVP Dallas, where After8 received capacity building support to eventually become its own standalone nonprofit. So speaking to my current public policy work, I just want to make some opening kind of remarks in terms of the work related to Philanthropy Southwest. We primarily work on public policy at the federal level, but we also are wanting to augment or increase our policy work at both the state and local levels. At the end of last year, we had an auspicious end last December with 2 big legislative wins around tax-related issues that had been a result of years of advocacy efforts. And then a few months ago, which now seems like a lifetime ago, we were gearing up for Foundations on the Hill, which is an advocacy effort every year in March, where philanthropic leaders and philanthropy support organizations like Philanthropy Southwest come to Washington and meet with congressional members and advocate on behalf of the charitable sector. This year, it was quite different, as you can probably imagine. And while we were able to meet with members, we were some of the last groups to be on the Hill before the Capitol closed to visitors due to COVID-19. It was indeed a really surreal time to be in Washington and meeting with House and Senate member offices who were really in the midst of trying to figure out how to respond during a global pandemic, and then also really just assessing the broader impact of this pandemic on the entire country as the whole nation was in the process of shutting down. You know, one of the biggest takeaways that I took away, or that we all took away, were the authentic conversations that we had and the true partnership with government, with philanthropy working with government. And, since then, there's been almost $3 trillion through the COVID relief legislation. The Senate is actually working now on a 5th COVID relief package, which is expected to be released later this month. And it remains critical that we continue to advocate on behalf of nonprofits and the charitable sector, supporting organizations such as food banks and direct service providers and smaller nonprofits and so many other organizations that are helping communities during this crisis, and also looking long-term as we look at recovery and what recovery will look like in a post-COVID world. So I'll leave it there, and I'll pass the mic over to Natalie, I believe.
Thank you, Hillary, and thank you to SVP Dallas for having all of us here today. Really appreciate the opportunity to engage in this dialogue because I think it's so important. But my name is Natalie Ossenfort. I'm the Texas director of a nonprofit organization called Alliance for Justice. Alliance for Justice, for those who aren't familiar with us, we are a nonprofit. We're a 501c3 based in Washington, D.C., but we also have 2 satellite offices in California, one in San Francisco, one in Los Angeles. And then our 3rd satellite office, and largely in part to SVP and their help when we were getting started here in 2015, but our 3rd satellite office is in Dallas. And then I'm also pleased to announce that we'll be opening our 4th office in Houston here by the end of the month. So very exciting times at AFJ. But again, our mission at Alliance for Justice is to make sure that every American has a voice in the government that serves them. And one of the ways that we try to advance this priority is through a program that we call our Bolder Advocacy Program. And what it does is it works with foundations, so private foundations, community foundations, other types of funders. It also works with nonprofit groups of all different shapes and sizes to, one, help them build their capacity to advocate, to help them understand what their strengths are and what their weaknesses are as an organization so that they can really engage in good, effective advocacy, but then to also make sure that they understand the rules associated with nonprofit advocacy. So a lot of times organizations get scared away from advocacy because they're not sure what they're allowed to do, what they should be doing, what they can be doing as nonprofits. And so we really try to help people understand what those rules are and how they can advocate boldly without running afoul of some obscure tax law that they didn't know exists, for example. And so we provide assistance on the rules that relate to the tax code, so federal level rules, also FEC rules for those who are interested in campaign finance questions. We also provide assistance on state level rules and local rules. And so if, for example, an organization needs help understanding what the lobbyist registration and reporting requirements are in Texas, that's something that we can help out with as well. And so through our workshops, mostly online now due to COVID, but they used to be in person, but through our workshops, our free technical assistance, which is available to any nonprofit in the country, period. They can call us and we have a lawyer on staff 5 days a week to help with their questions. And our free legal resources. We have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of resources on our website that people can access. Those allow us to really provide nonprofits with the education they need to advocate both lawfully and effectively. And the reason that we do this is because our view is that nonprofits, especially service-based nonprofits and advocacy nonprofits, but nonprofits are generally in the best position to really understand what the problems are on the ground and then also how to address those issues. And so I think Hillary mentioned food banks, or I think that was mentioned by one of the panelists earlier, but if, for example, you're an organization that provides food to your community, you know what some of the reasons are that those individuals need to access you for that food. It might be a lack of affordable housing. It might be some sort of childcare issue that's preventing them from getting the job that they need to take care of their families. But all of these things, all of this desire and this need to provide these services hinges from some sort of systemic problem. And a lot of times what we find are that nonprofits become the experts on those issues, even if they never intended to be the experts on those issues. And so what we try to do is really to empower those groups to not only put a Band-Aid on the problem and to provide those services, but also to look at the root causes of the issues so that they can do the good policy work necessary to hopefully one day put themselves out of business, right? So that's what we're all kind of doing as nonprofits, is trying to put ourselves out of business, ideally. But yeah, so that's a little bit about Alliance for Justice. Again, thanks to SVP for having us, and I'm going to turn it back to Prisma.
Thank you so much, Hillary, and thank you so much for those comments. I know that we definitely want to learn more, and we'll be hearing from all of our panelists who will be sharing a little bit more about advocacy. And for those that are just joining us, we are on social media. If you're posting, you could use the hashtag SVPD workshops, and you can post and tag us as well. So in this workshop, we're really looking to engage all of you as leaders in this conversation of advocacy work and how we're doing that now. I think we mentioned some comments around COVID-19, and I think within the nonprofit sector, we're definitely trying to find solutions to a variety of different issues that have come up and changes within our work. And so, I think in terms of the perspective we're looking for today is not just nonprofits, but just different individuals, different groups, and how they can do advocacy work, and also specific to engaging others, in particular with the nonprofits within their mission, how it can actually align with them versus be a distraction, which I think is, from my experience with SVP and our advisees, sometimes it's, the question comes up, like, how do I start it? And so with that, I'll kick off the panelist perspectives, and, all of you share a deeper understanding in your, as far as your work goes. So if we want to start off with Susan, that'd be great.
Thank you, Prisma. Thanks, everybody. So, I want to talk a little bit about my experience with advocacy, which is long, multiple sessions, and I have done everything from art installations, children's art installations in the Texas Capitol, to actually setting up a preschool classroom a number of years ago in the Texas State Capitol, because everybody knows children are really engaging, and certainly elected officials, as well as anybody else, likes to get their picture taken with young children. So my primary focus area in terms of policy and advocacy has been in the arena of early childhood education and early care and education, expansion of quality and access. And I've been doing that for well over 20 years. In this last year, and particularly in Texas and across the nation, we've seen such an uptick in support for, bipartisan support for strong early childhood education, really understanding that the first 5 years of life and even those first 3 years of life are critically important for brain development and setting the foundation for all of our future learning. But it's important to know that that didn't just happen a couple of years ago or just last year. That's like years and years, 20 plus years of foundational work that many advocates across the nation have worked on, and particularly in Texas. And so it's a multi-session strategy that eventually has led to not quite universal pre-K in our state, but pretty close to it. And increasingly, although we still have a long way to go, better access to quality childcare and resources to support those that work in the childcare industry, as well as those parents that depend upon it to work. So, again, it begs the question, if it takes that long to do something, why would an organization, a nonprofit, or anybody get involved in policy and advocacy? Move slowly. Sometimes it seems kind of convoluted how you work through it. It requires both incredible patience as well as the ability to move at lightning speed when the opportunity arises. And it entails hours and hours and hours, endless hours of collaboration and coordination. Again, why should nonprofits and philanthropists get involved? And there are two primary reasons. The first one is a big one. The government, federal, state, and local, is the primary funder of education and social services, and that directly impacts the effectiveness of local philanthropy and nonprofits. So if we want to be successful, then we need to apply that same strategy for relationship development and working with our partners and the government, as we do with other resource development efforts. That's number one reason. Additionally, Natalie said this so well, but really the most effective way to address systemic barriers that drive racial inequities and other disparities is through policy and advocacy. It takes a depth of knowledge and understanding as to how those things work, and to understand that there are many regulations, from zoning to school funding formulas, you name it, that were put in place intentionally and actually present incredible barriers for progress for individuals, particularly those people of color. And so understanding what those obstacles are and addressing them at the root cause is critically important. Otherwise, as program providers and nonprofits, we were often just addressing symptoms without really going to the root cause of the issue. And so program services alone, without policy and advocacy, will really never, as Natalie said, put ourselves out of business, which hopefully is our goal, our end game in nonprofit work. The United Way, just to give you specifically, in our organization, we've been involved in advocacy work for a number of years, but the evolution of our strategy over particularly the last 12 years has led to a greater, more focused effort. We have a tremendous public policy director, our VP of Policy, Stephanie Mace. She's led our advocacy work over these last years and also engaged strong volunteer leadership, particularly with our Women of Tocqueville, for getting focused on key issues. When I came to United Way, and a little bit before me, we had an advocacy agenda that was probably 50 pages long. We focused on many, many, many issues. Over the years, we have evolved to be very targeted in the key areas of which we are focused: education, income, and health, and then diving down or driving down into very specific issues throughout the years. We've also become very focused on understanding that while working in Austin or at the federal government is really important, that's what happens every other year at the Big Pink Building in Austin is not all of advocacy and policy work. Important, but what leads up to that work and what happens after the work and partnering with our elected officials is critically important, as is advocacy at the local and the federal level as well. So an understanding, again, that the process is slow and deliberate and that thinking through the long-term impact is critical. And I'm going to share my slides, my screen just a little bit here to just give you a quick overview of United Way. And here is just to focus on our advocacy and public policy. How it is to cultivate relationships with elected officials, whether they're at the local, state, and increasingly at the federal level. Educate and engage advocates. Again, one of our key calls to action, and as my colleagues on the panel said, everybody's opportunity and responsibility also is to advocate, but to put the information in our hands so that we know we have the resources and the information and we're well educated as to what we're focused on. Collectively driving change by focusing again on areas of key alignment. So, our policy agenda has gotten narrower and narrower, focused on very key issues as we move forward in our work. We know that it's real and it's long-standing. The outcomes are good. It's a fantastic way to engage volunteers because as staff, we could never have enough staff to do this alone. Plus, volunteers are the lifeblood of our organization and our community, and they also are constituents, and elected officials definitely want to hear from them. Finally, just a quick little thing here is some of the policy priorities of United Way of Metropolitan Dallas. Again, our work focuses on the attainment of our goals, our Aspire 2030 goals in education, income, and health. What we focus on in advocacy is the same thing that we focus on in our investments, the work we do, the partnerships that we drive. We work again at all levels of the government. We focus on bipartisan issues. We stay away from politics and focus on policy. We prioritize generally, although this is not a hard and fast rule, but it is important to us organizationally, but we prioritize no or low cost actions, and we have a priority of our local and state work. So again, it is a central part of the work that we do at United Way of Metropolitan Dallas. And as for many nonprofit organizations, I would say advocacy needs to be a focus of your work at some level, as well as for our foundation and funding partners as well. So thank you. And I will turn it back to Hillary, I believe.
Can you all hear me? Okay, perfect. Well, I got some feedback that I might have been projecting too much initially with the voice, so I'll be a little quieter. But advocacy is about being heard. And I mentioned in my opening remarks that, advocacy is everybody's business and we all have a story to tell. And I just briefly, my advocacy journey comes from both advocating at the federal and local levels. I'm a lifelong Texan, moved to Virginia to go to college, and then migrated up to Washington and stayed there for almost 20 years. And at that time, or during the time, worked at the national level with a national membership association where we advocated on behalf of legal aid programs, serving low-income clients with legal services. And then from there, worked at the local level, because I think oftentimes folks forget that our nation's capital is a city within a city, and the same issues that are we're taking on at the national level are happening in the backyard of many households. And so worked with a local organization focusing on juvenile justice and child welfare related matters, and actually authored a report on school discipline practices, both for traditional public schools and charter schools, and looking at the unfair practices and the disproportionate impact, particularly on Black and Brown students. And that work really, I think, allowed me to transition well to Dallas. When I moved here about 5 years ago, my husband works with the federal government and took a job here, and one of the questions that I had when I moved here was, what the heck am I going to do in Dallas? And so I, took some time to be a mom, and then, figure out the public policy landscape here, and really wanted to focus on educational equity issues and poverty reduction, which are very apparent here in Dallas. And one of the issues that I worked on initially was looking at disciplinary practices in Dallas Independent School District, and the work of Miguel Solis leading that charge within the DISD school board of looking at early grade suspensions and making them not part of a way to discipline students. And really, again, looking at the disproportionate impact there, and working with advocacy groups like Leadership ISD that really trains leaders, local leaders, civic leaders, and members within the community to be their own advocates within their communities and within the school system. It really struck a personal chord with me because, I'm also a DISD parent of two children that are in Dallas ISD. So I think, again, when you advocate, you're telling the story. It's about being able to uplift the voices of others, and I think that's a lot of what the work currently that I'm focused on at Philanthropy Southwest, and what we're focused on is being able to tell the story of philanthropy. And I will say that we are in a period of reimagination and wanting to grow our public policy work. And honestly, I think that's a trend that we're seeing a lot within philanthropy. The Center for Effective Philanthropy actually came out with a report in May, and I will put the link to the report or send it to SVP Dallas. The title of it is Policy Influence, What Foundations Are Doing and Why. And, it's really surveying foundations and understanding, I think foundations understanding and wanting to be engaged, but what that looks like, and being able to do that effectively. I know that for Philanthropy Southwest, we were planning to go on a roadshow this spring that got postponed due to COVID-19. But our purpose there, one of the purposes there was to be able to travel throughout the Southwest and to meet regionally and locally with with the foundation communities and being able to amplify and empower the voices within the charitable sector and be able to tell our story. I think that in addition to looking at advocacy at the federal level, others have already spoken to this, but there is great opportunity. And actually that report that I just referenced from the Center for Effective Philanthropy found that there is a lot more advocacy and engagement at the state and local levels, and that you can really drive home real systemic change at that level. And I think that we're finding, as many congressional members are able to go back to their offices or working remotely, that they're spending more time in their, locally at the local levels. I know we're going to talk more about what kind of this remote interaction looks like with elected officials, which is important, during this time, in this season. Also want to point to the rulemaking process. I know Natalie's going to get into some of the nuts and bolts. That could be a whole separate webinar, the do's and don'ts around advocacy. We were happy to have Natalie and the Boulder Advocacy Initiative come and talk to our group of grant makers earlier this year in January, explain the do's and don'ts. But one area that you do have free reign is around the rulemaking process. And Philanthropy Southwest last month actually had a webinar where we had very seasoned Treasury staffers that were encouraging it, that this is a process that they want to hear from the community, and being able during that public, once a rule is published or in that proposed rulemaking process, having the community be able to submit their feedback and buy into that process. And so that's another really ripe area when you're thinking about advocacy to think about that. So I'll stop there and pass it on to Dan or Natalie.
I think I will take it from there. Thank you, Hillary. So I'll just start by echoing what my colleagues have said. I think it's a pretty clear connection between the most nonprofits and their mission and the role that advocacy can play. And I think you heard that from my colleagues, and it bears repeating. But I think advocacy really is required if you're looking to drive larger systemic change in the area that you're working in. That's important. I think nonprofits, as Natalie mentioned, they bring an expertise in the area. They're often directly affected by the government decisions that are being made, and therefore they have a stake in what the outcome is. And also from the perspective of Congress or the state legislature or city council, any elected officials out there, they, at the end of the day, they're focused on policy and they're focused on the big picture, but they want to translate that bigger picture and really understand what the impact is on their community. And that's where we get into the whole idea of constituent relationships. So as a nonprofit operating in Dallas, Texas, you are a constituent of the elected officials who represent Dallas, Texas, and whatever area that they might be engaged in policy, while they might look to national policy experts in terms of evaluating some of the research, at the end of the day, they want to have that connection to the local community, and that's what a nonprofit can provide. So you've decided that you do want to get involved in advocacy, and now you're saying how, or your board's asking you how, and where do you start? So I like to think about the first step, really, when you want to get involved in advocacy, is really understanding the ecosystem that surrounds whatever policy area, which could be healthcare or early childhood education, or maybe a specific issue. In healthcare, a specific issue might be Medicaid expansion and trying to drive Medicaid expansion in Texas. That would be a very specific part of healthcare. But whenever you're thinking about that, what you want to focus on, then you got to think about the larger ecosystem. And because I like pictures and I think they're better to look at than having to stare at me talking, I did put together a visual to help explain what I am talking about. And hopefully this is now sharing my screen. But again, think about the ecosystem around a policy area or an issue as the place where information is circulating and decisions are being made. And you need to figure out in that area, issue area, where, how, and by whom are those decisions being made? And then who is generating and sharing the information that's influencing that decision? And I'm not going to go through this entire slide, but I really did map out kind of in most areas, this is going to be the people who are operating within that ecosystem. Of course, you have the government. The government can be engaged as a funder in an area. The government can be engaged as a regulator in an area, as Hillary was just referring to the rulemaking process that they use. And the government can also be engaged as a provider in a specific area. For instance, in education, you have the public education system. So you need to understand what role government might be playing, and also focus on what branch of government is influencing it. Is Congress very influential because there's a particular statute that really governs the area? Or is it something that's more left up to the executive discretion, where an administrative agency might be your primary player that you need to work? Levels of government. Is it a federal government? Is it state government? Is it county or municipal government? Medicare is almost solely the role of the federal government. So if you're talking about healthcare for people over 65, then you're talking about Medicare. Medicaid, by contrast, is funded in part by the federal government, where the federal government sets pretty broad standards for how the states need to design their Medicaid program, but there are a lot of things left up to states, and therefore the state relationships are very important. Medicaid. Elsewhere on here, and I won't go through it again, this whole slide. Happy to talk about it offline with anyone who has a specific area that they're thinking about. But the rest of the circles are really about information and influence. You've got experts and thought leaders who are typically generating a lot of research and policy development. You have advocacy groups, some of whom often play a policy development role, but generally they're more focused on driving government action on the proposals that are coming out of experts and thought leaders. And then I've already talked about the nonprofit community and the business community who either have an operational connection to the decisions that are being made, or maybe from a CSR or mission perspective, they want to drive government action in a particular area. Advocacy, really, the way to think about this is about thinking about what role you play in this ecosystem and what role you want to play in this ecosystem, you know, as an expert, as a source of research, as a more advocacy group, as developing policy proposals, and then focusing on the relationships and how do you build relationships within with others to help shape decisions in the direction that your organization believes that they need to go in a particular area. So that is, again, just a quick visual. I wanted to get that out on the table. I think we'll have time for questions, and we could talk more about how do you get started and what are strategies and tactics to be building relationships in different parts of this ecosystem. But I think that's a good time to turn it over to Natalie, so she can maybe delve a little bit more into the things as you're thinking about the role that you want to play in advocacy, the the way to think about the how that will keep you compliant with the various regulations, legal requirements for any organization, especially a organization with a nonprofit tax status needs to keep in mind. So, Natalie?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as well and just go ahead and pull up this chart. And I think the burden falls on me at this point to kind of explain what the rules are in relation to nonprofit advocacy, because depending on what type of nonprofit you work with or you work for or you serve on a board for, there are different rules that apply to what you can do in the advocacy space specifically. So to start, I mean, I think when we all think of nonprofits, generally the first thing you think of is a public charity, a 501c3 public charity. These are also going to encompass things like community foundations. So public foundations, churches and religious institutions fall into that public charity paradigm as well. But generally speaking, these organizations are really special, and you'll have to excuse, I think my dogs have decided that now is the perfect time to start barking at someone, but they should stop shortly if you can hear them. But yeah, so these organizations are organizations like Alliance for Justice, the nonprofit organization that I work for. They're also organizations like community foundations. So locally here in Dallas, groups like the Texas Women's Foundation would be considered a community foundation. They are tax-exempt organizations, and contributions to these types of 501c3s are tax deductible. So there's an incentive for donors to give to these types of organizations because they can take that tax deduction at the end of the tax year. But in exchange for that incredibly favorable tax treatment, there are going to be limits placed on the advocacy that they can do. But the good news is that even with those limits, there are still many, many types of advocacy that public charities can engage in. And so specifically when we talk about lobbying activities, I won't go into the details of the definitions here, but we can connect later or maybe answer that in Q&A. But when we talk about lobbying, attempts to impact public policy, maybe to get a law passed in Austin during a legislative session, those are things that lobbying is an activity that public charities can actually engage in. And in fact, the tax code places limits on how much lobbying public charities can do, but it does not prohibit it. And that's oftentimes a misconception with a lot of nonprofits. They think that they're not allowed to lobby when in fact they can. So good news here, public charities are allowed to lobby as long as they stay within some lobbying limits. The other good news there is that depending on what type of public charity you are, you can make what's called the 501h election, which can actually increase your lobbying limit up to about 20% of your organizational budget, which is a pretty substantial amount of your resources that can be put towards lobbying if you know how to maximize those lobbying limits. So that's obviously an option for 501c3 public charities. The one type of advocacy that 501c3 public charities are not allowed to engage in is they're not allowed to support or oppose candidates for public office. So they can't endorse a candidate. They can't try to convince people who to vote for in a candidate election. But the good news, again, is that they can lobby for policy change. They can do that critical systems change work that we talk about so often, as long as they stay within their lobbying limits. Now, to look just to the left of that public charity column, there's a column for private foundations, 501c3s as well. Again, these are tax-exempt organizations. Contributions to them are tax deductible, but they generally get those contributions from a more limited pool of resources. So whereas a public charity gets donations from hundreds of donors and lots of different foundations, private foundations usually have a more limited source of contributions. And so they're slightly more restricted in terms of the advocacy that they can do as a 501c3. Again, in terms of election season advocacy, private foundations are not allowed to support or oppose candidates for public office. So that rule applies to all 501c3s, regardless of the type. But in terms of their lobbying, they're effectively not allowed to lobby or to earmark grant funds for lobbying, because if they do, they'll be taxed. So the foundation will be taxed, and then also any managers with the foundations who approved the expenditure could potentially be taxed on that as well. And so while there's not an outright prohibition on private foundation lobbying, there's effectively a prohibition in the terms of this pretty steep excise tax that can be imposed on the foundation and its managers. Now, The good news here is that that doesn't mean that private foundations can't support organizations that lobby, and it doesn't mean that grants given by private foundations can't be used for lobbying. And in fact, there are a couple of different ways that you can structure your grant agreements as a private foundation to make sure that your grantees have the flexibility to lobby, but without jeopardizing your own C3 status or exposing yourself to that tax. And so again, that's something we can talk about later if anyone's interested. But, you know, takeaways here. For all 501c3s, you can't support or oppose candidates for public office. But depending on if you're a private foundation or a public charity, there might be some flexibility in terms of lobbying or funding lobbying activities of your grantees. Now, that's different than 501c4s, C5s, C6s. When we're talking about C4s, C5s, and C6s, they're also tax-exempt organizations. So very similar to C3s in that regard, but they don't get tax-deductible contributions. Of course, C4s are social welfare organizations. And when we talk about C5s and C6s, we're thinking about trade associations, unions. So these are groups like the Sierra Club or the AARP. They don't get those tax deductible contributions. And so they have more flexibility in terms of their advocacy. And so they can actually do an unlimited amount of lobbying. And so if they want to spend all of their dollars on lobbying for policy change, they can. That's totally within their purview. They are also allowed to do some electioneering, some partisan electoral activities. So they are allowed to support or oppose candidates for public office as long as it's a secondary activity of the organization and not the primary activity. There's not a real clear, the tax code doesn't tell us, you know, what's secondary versus what's primary. So different organizations take different approaches. It's certainly less than 50% would have to be that partisan activity, but a lot of tax lawyers are more comfortable with either a 30-70 split or maybe a 60-40, something like that. But again, they are allowed to support candidates as long as it's a secondary activity and they can do an unlimited amount of lobbying. Another type of tax-exempt organization, a PAC. We hear a lot about PACs and we hear a lot from PACs. I will say that my mailbox has been jammed full this primary season with mailings from PACs. Again, tax-exempt. They don't get tax-deductible contributions. They don't do much in terms of lobbying for policy change because it's usually a taxable activity for PACs. But they have a sole primary purpose most of the time of supporting or opposing candidates. And of course, these are the basic rules for different types of nonprofits, and there are a lot more types of nonprofits and a lot of different rules that apply and can help with those too at some point in time. But you know, these are different than the rules that are going to apply just to for-profit corporations, for example. So for-profit corporations can do a lot of lobbying. They also can make some independent expenditures in support or opposition of candidates. While they can't make, in Texas, they are not allowed to make contributions to candidates. They can form affiliated PACs in order to engage in those types of activities. But again, focusing specifically on the nonprofit work, that's this chart right here. But you just have to kind of understand that depending on what type of organization you're with, depending on what type of organization you work for, there may be different things that you can do. And you also have to notice that a lot of times effective advocacy is not just done by your organization individually. A lot of times it'll take a team and multiple organizations will come together to do very good policy work, form advocacy coalitions. When you do that, you have to make sure that your activities stay in alignment with your rules. So just because you're a C3, but you join a coalition with a C4 doesn't mean you automatically, it doesn't mean you get to reap the benefits of their tax exempt status and follow their rules. And so it's always important to know what the rules are, know how they apply, know how to track your lobbying to make sure that you're counting it against your lobbying limit and so forth. So that's a basic overview. And I think, Prisma, I'm going to pass it back to you. It looks like you've got a good connection right now. And so we'll hit off the Q&A.
Hey, Natalie, it's Natalie and Prisma, it's Dan. I just wanted to jump in on one thing here that people, I think would be helpful for people to keep, that I've had a lot of, remember the electoral politics can go beyond candidates as well. So in states, especially like California, where a lot is done by ballot initiative, there are rules that govern what nonprofit organizations can do. That's considered to be similar to so the rules can be different, but it is something that you'd want to fit within that bucket of electoral advocacy that where you really need to make sure that you are getting good advice before you engage in those activities?
Yeah, and I can actually address that just really quickly. Ballot measure advocacy. So if you want to encourage people to vote for or against a constitutional amendment or maybe a bond measure at the local level, the IRS categorizes that and the tax code categorizes that as lobbying. So it would need to count against your lobbying limit if you're a 501c3 public charity, but it would not be in violation of the rules against supporting or opposing candidates since you're dealing with a measure as opposed to a candidate. So there is a distinction there, but legally speaking, in terms of the tax code treatment of ballot measures, that is something that would be considered lobbying. And so it's something that a public charity could do, but something that a private foundation, for example, could not advocate on. The other thing with ballot measures in particular is that in Texas, it's regulated by the Texas Election Code. And so if you do any ballot measure advocacy, just be aware of that. Because there aren't going to be restrictions on exactly how you do that, but there may be reporting requirements. So if you spend over a certain dollar amount, you might be required to report that to the state. But that's, again, something that we can help out with too.
Thank you so much, Dan, for jumping in and addressing that, and Natalie for your responses and detailed information. I think all of our panelists here today have experience and are definitely here to answer any questions. I know that some people have started to submit questions in the Q&A feature of Zoom. So if you have a question at any point, please feel free to submit that. We will be addressing those in a few minutes. And so I guess with that, I wanted to turn to more of like the strategic advocacy planning. I know that organizations in particular, we're speaking to our public charities or 501c3s that are, wondering, we mentioned like, here's how you might want to get started. I think that there might be, if the panelists could clarify or maybe give a couple of examples of what because a common conclusion that I hear is that, these are tactics, it's confused with advocacy strategy. And so if you could just share with us and open to anyone, some differences, maybe how they affect one another, right? How these tactics are used within strategy.
I can jump in there. Okay, so, sometimes talking about the difference between tactics and strategies is kind of like arguing between the difference of goals and objectives, but there is a real difference. So a tactic in my way of thinking is kind of like an activity. So a tactic might be, we're going to make legislative visits, or we're going to invite elected officials to come out and visit our program, or we're going to engage our volunteers to have a special day at the Capitol. Those are tactics. Strategies, I think, would be defined as more as, say, what are we leading to? And so sometimes if we're thinking for instance, in Texas, you might say, we've got a multi-session strategy. I'm going to say this, I've got my end game, as I talked about at the beginning, maybe I want to get to more fully funded public pre-K. And this session, I'm going to move the ball this forward using these tactics and these visits. Then I'm going to move it forward. The next one, but the strategy is what my end game that I'm getting to. The tactics tend to be what are the actions that I'm taking along the way. Why it's important to distinguish the difference, or to at least have a strategy, is because you could be doing a whole lot of activities like running around visiting people, and I've got to, I have been, early in my advocacy days in offices of elected officials, and one wonderful senator said to me, you're kind of wasting your time talking to me. I'm already on your team. So, really, let's think about what would be your strategy to who you might outreach to and what parts of the state, and who do you need to win over. Don't spend all of your time trying to win over the people that you've already got on board. And so that would be where I would say the differences lie.
Susan, let me build on that with your early childhood education example. I think strategy, is about thinking about that space. And let's just talking about funding for early. Your strategy, when you are thinking about how is the early childhood currently in Texas, is that funding mechanism an efficient mechanism, and our issue whether we're putting enough funding into it or how that funding is being distributed, or mechanisms inadequate and we need to develop a new kind of funding mechanism? That's a strategic analysis that you're going through. Really, what is the lay of the land right now? How does the process work right now? And figuring out what exactly it is you need to change to accomplish your objective. And then the tactics, as you mentioned, get into, okay, now if I know what I'm going to be seeking, what do I have to do to go sell people on that idea? Developing some modeling and research on it. Do I know who the members, I talked about constituent relationships with and getting involved with one of your elected officials. The key is getting involved with the elected officials who are really ingrained in that particular policy issue, have a level of expertise that they've developed over time, and you'll be going to them because you are wanting them to champion it. But that's when you're getting into tactics. But the idea of strategy really kind of goes back to my ecosystem. Mm-hmm. Do you understand exactly what it is in the government that is connected to whatever your objective is, what's working, what's not working?
Yeah, no, I would agree. I mean, I saw in the chat box somebody asking if the slides were going to be distributed after this, which I'm sure we'll be able to do that. But you're exactly right, Dan. I mean, understanding that ecosystem and understanding that, you know, how the system works and which levers you need to push with what direction, and then developing that long game is your strategy. And again, I'd say understanding that a strategy for, you know, changing a specific issue or addressing a specific systemic challenge is generally not something that happens one time or 1 year. I mean, figuring out that this is a generally not only multi-year, but it's oftentimes multi-system, because as you see in that ecosystem, the intersection and the connections are many, and you really have to understand what you're doing. You know, you don't want to cause any unintentional consequences by not necessarily having a good strategy, but you also don't want to waste time either. And you could waste a lot of time on a lot of really engaging tactics that don't move you forward. And so again, thinking through that strategy is critically important. And one of the best strategists I know is Dan Waldman. So,
thank you.
Hillary, do you have something to add?
Yes, I think I echo everything that Susan and Dan have said. I just also want to say the importance of listening to your community. I know that for the advocacy that we did around the school discipline efforts with Dallas ISD, we built a coalition of community members, and there was a school discipline task force that the district put together. And it is critical when you're advocating to make sure that it's a community process, a community-led process. And so I just making sure that all voices are at the table.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. You know, and I think we're discussing, and I heard several of your presentations about relationships, and I know within the profit community and definitely all of our social impact organizations, we are, you know, relationships and how those are important. And I just keep thinking to, you know, the topic of today's session is revolving around the crisis, right? And so I think that, you know, previously maybe we thought we'd stand up and go up to offices, call, be there in person. So I wondered from the panelists and maybe Dan or Hillary, maybe you have some insight as far as how do we maintain these personal relationships with our, you know, members of Congress, elected officials, you know, if maybe their focus is on something else right now, right? And how do we continue to maintain those relationships or maybe even build new ones?
I can kick things off. I mean, I think that this is a time where we, can be creative, and I think accessibility. I think it's greater to some extent now, and this Zoom calls and video conferencing, and it really does allow you to stay connected with elected officials and their staff. And so I think that's one way where you can do video conferencing, organizing virtual town halls. I know SVP Dallas had Representative Allred part of a session recently. And so I think this is creating an opportunity for greater accessibility because folks don't have to travel anywhere. And, it's incumbent to be able to, again, bring together, all voices if you do play in a virtual town hall so that, that you can have a robust discussion.
I think Dan.
Let me add to that. One, I think, again, think strategically about relationships because, as Susan noted, there's a lot of people involved in a different policy area, and that includes elected officials. And you really want to make sure that your time is well spent, especially since this is an add-on to what your organization's core daily work. And it can easily become busy work that is not resulting in any impact. So, when you're thinking about elected representatives in Congress, for instance, I work in healthcare. Congressman Mark Vesey from Fort Worth is a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, one of the most important committees in terms of the healthcare industry, both financing healthcare and regulating healthcare. So he's one that all healthcare providers in DFW want to make sure that they have a relationship with him because he's actually at the table when they're working on healthcare issues. So I think you want to think about where do you want to invest your time, and then you come up. Want to make sure that they're benefiting. What you have that is a benefit in the advocacy space is information. You understand what's going on the ground, and you want to help give that information to them because that helps them in doing what they have to do in terms of making decisions. So that's really important. And when you find building that relationship, yes, everything that Hillary was just pointing to, a town hall with your members, inviting them to come and speak to your board or address your board on a Zoom call, making sure that when you're sending out communications, you're including them on the mailing list. And then the thing is, go beyond the elected official. Who is it on their staff who they rely upon to see issue, and try to form a relationship there, because the member themselves, they have a lot of things on their plate and they hire staff to help them sort through all of the information out there and pick out what's important. So you want to focus on that staff relationship as much as the relationship with the elected official herself or himself.
Natalie, Susan, have anything else to add there?
No, I just wanted to concur with Dan. Again, sometimes when you, embark into advocacy, you feel like if you're asked to or given to a staff person to speak to in an office that you've been downgraded or something. But honestly, those are the experts and the content experts, and they sometimes, at least to me, when I go to someone's office, look like they might have been dropped off by their mother because they're so young. At least apparently they are smart, hardworking, and that's who elected officials at any level counts on. And so being able to have that relationship with staff members, giving them information that's usable to them, and sometimes even just targeting a convening or a meeting specifically for staff without having to try and focus on getting the elected officials together in a room or even individually is a really smart way to go. And again, I would say never, ever, ever discount the amazing resource that staffers in those offices are, because they are some of the hardest working people in the world. And so always those relationships are golden.
Thank you. Natalie, anything else to add?
No, I mean, the only other thing I can think of, I think they've hit the nail on the head here, but back from my practical experience as an advocate with the Innocence Project of Texas prior to being at Alliance for Justice, one thing that we also found was very effective is if you do get that meeting with the legislator or you do get that meeting with the legislative staffer, make sure to follow up. Wait a few days and send a nice little thank you note. And that way you don't just find your materials, your information, your message at the bottom of some pile that they're never going to think about again. So follow up, say thank you, and just keep building those relationships.
Yeah. And, one more thing I'd add on to that is elected officials follow social media a lot. And so, posting your thanks on social media, tagging them on your Twitter feed or your Instagram, getting pictures is really, really helpful. And so, and tweeting thanks, tweeting specific issues is another really good tactic as well.
And I'd add to that, Susan, social media is a very, very good source of information, especially if you're early on in your advocacy journey and you're really trying to understand in a particular area. Going on and finding the advocacy organizations, finding the academic researchers who are very involved in this area, and following them on social media can get you into that information flow that's so important as part of the ecosystem.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think this leads me to another question, and we are receiving questions from the audience, and we will start turning to those here now. And I think that, looking at them, most of our audience or nonprofits are still asking, what is the first step? What is the first step to doing that? I know that we all want to advocate for our communities, and we say that a lot, but what is the first action step? And I'll start off. Maybe Dan could jump in first.
Yeah, I'd start off with kind of mapping it out on a strategic plan. Have an advocacy strategic plan, go through, make sure that you're really clear on how you're defining your objective. What's the policy objective you have, whether it's around increasing funding or it involves, creating new ways to educate and build the pipeline of early childhood educators for Texas, which we work together on. But really understanding what it is that you want to do, where is that decision going to get made or getting made, and what's the people who are influencing it. And again, what you should arrive at is what is our role that our organization can play here to help move the ball down the field. And then you go from there. And then it's an issue of execution. And I do caution, it is very easy to get caught up in wanting to play all those roles and be involved in every aspect of that ecosystem, which for most nonprofits, you very quickly come to an issue of resources, including staff bandwidth. And the ability to continue and maintain relationships over time. And you see a lot of nonprofits who kind of start an advocacy program and it unfortunately dies off because it does take some commitment to maintain it over time. So I would say start with a more narrow focus to begin with and build on that over time, and be aware of who else is potentially driving work or providing leadership in your space where you can play a collaborative role with them. You're not taking everything on yourself, but you're supportive and you're building those relationships and engaging, and then build the role over time.
And related to that, I would suggest too that, while you're trying to figure out what your game plan is, right? What you're wanting to achieve. Also take the time to do the assessment of your advocacy capacity, because as Dan mentioned, a lot of groups do fizzle out because advocacy is a long-term game. It's, I wish we could just snap our fingers and change a policy overnight, but that's never how it works for the most part. So you have to have the resources, you have to have the people power to get it done, but you also have to have the funding to sustain those efforts over a long period of time. You have to know who your community partners are, who your coalition partners are, to see what they can do to help you fill in any gaps that you might have within your own program. One of the things that we offer at AFJ, and I'll put the link in the chat, but we have a capacity assessment tool that we call ACT, our advocacy capacity tool. And you can spend about an hour, or you can do the quick version that takes about 10 minutes, but it'll really force you to think, organizationally, what are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? It will help to score your capacity so that you can really visualize where those are, so that you can start filling in those gaps and actually create a sustainable program.
Only thing I would add is, I think, starting with arming yourself with information and making sure that you're well versed on issues. This is said often in the public policy space that you know little about a lot, but if you are advocating on a specific issue, know your issue and be able to have data to be able to support it. Many elected officials and staffers that you are working with will ask for that, and it's will only support efforts to be able to have that. So. Know your information, know your issues, or glean information and issues, and be able to have data to back it up. And I will say, Philanthropy Southwest, we have an online educational exchange on our website. I'll post the link, but it's a wonderful exchange of information, of reports, particularly for the grant making community. So definitely would recommend it to you to take a look at.
Yeah. All good points. The thing I go back to, and Dan and each of you said something about this, but it is so important to know who else is in your space and how you can align on issues, because it's really easy to quickly cancel each other out if you have a number of people advocating with slightly different voices around the same issue. So lining up and coalescing and agreeing on what the message is and what the asks are is critically important as well.
So I'm our questions and that are coming in from the audience, a lot of them are around what resources are out there. And I just want to mention that I know that Natalie and maybe a few others are to put some resources in the chat. And so you should be able to see those coming through. And one specific question we have here is around what resources are there for digital organizing. And I think, Natalie, maybe you dropped a link about that, but maybe if you could talk a little bit more about that, digital organizing, and maybe especially for groups that maybe have not done this, the traditional way or in a formal way.
Yeah, I mean, I won't say that I'm an expert on digital organizing. What I can offer, and what I put the link in the chat box for, is we do have a resource at Boulder Advocacy, Alliance for Justice's program, that focuses on nonprofit advocacy in the digital age. And so when you think about those compliance questions, can we say this? Should we say this? Is it permissible for us as a nonprofit to engage in X activity? A lot of that gets complicated by social media. But that's not to say that it's not still very doable. One of the good things is that, when we talk about lobbying limits for public charities, one of the ways that public charities can measure their lobbying limits and get up to 20% of their budget allocated towards lobbying is by making what's called the 501h election. Well, what's really cool about that is that it's an expense-based test. So how much does social media cost you? Well, other than your time, it doesn't cost anything. I can sign up for a free Twitter account. I can sign up for a free Facebook account, a free Instagram account. I'm not paying for that. So as a nonprofit, if I'm trying to get a policy changed, I can tweet at Senator Cruz asking for him to vote on SBX. And what did that cost me as an organization? Basically nothing. It maybe took me 10 seconds to type that tweet. So you can use social media in very effective ways as a nonprofit, but do be aware of the rules, right? So make sure that you're not using your C3 account to retweet candidate campaign account messages. That could be, you know, get you into those dicey areas when it comes to electioneering. But that's what that guide really talks about, is how to maximize your impact with social media and how to do so in a safe, legal way.
Yeah, thank you for that. In terms of coronavirus and, you know, the times now, you know, I'm just thinking, are there certain issues that we're seeing more of currently? And you know, I see Dan already shaking his head, and you know, if you could just describe a little about that and maybe how nonprofits can plug in during this time.
Well, I think the issues currently right now around COVID that everyone is dealing with is funding, obviously. And I think Hillary had already mentioned the various relief packages. We're now, she said 5, I think we're counting it as 4.0. 2 of them folded in together at some point, but they are, you know, there was, thankfully, the major package, the CARES Act and the subsequent bill after that, really did ensure that nonprofits were eligible for a lot of the relief funds that did come down through, like the Paycheck Protection Program and the Main Street Lending Program. They also were looking at putting money out through existing grant programs. So again, I work with the Dallas Theater Center. We're very with the arts. If you looked at the National Endowment for the Arts, they put some more money in there going through the states. And then they loosened restrictions such as requirements for matching funds during the public health emergency. So funding is the #1 issue, and I think that continues to be the focus. I will tell you, I'm more concerned, and I think anyone who's operating particularly in social services and education, areas that are funded by states and local governments, huge concern looking forward as we go into, because states and local governments have to balance their budgets each year. So when you're looking at the trend in tax revenues, property tax revenues, income tax revenues, and then on the other side of the equation, significantly higher demand for many social safety net programs and other expenses that governments are paying for COVID response. That is the ingredients for a very much of a next legislative cycle. And currently we're feeling it in Dallas with the discussion over the city budget. So I think that we're at the cusp of some very significant need to be made because of a funding crisis. Another issue that I know is of importance to service providers is, whether they're for-profit or not-for-profit, is the idea of liability protections related to COVID. If you are engaged in service and especially in something where it's hard to socially distance, if you've got a workplace that people have to come to, then Congress and the state legislature are looking at what can be done to provide reasonable protections on liability, so that we don't have a creation of a significant crisis in the future from unclear rules regarding liability if people are exposed to COVID-19. So those are some specific COVID issues. I don't know if there's other panelists who have other thoughts on things that we're all facing right now.
Yeah, you know, thanks, Dan. Those are great. I think, you know, again, and you touched on this definitely, but education in particular, you know, every student across the state has had their education disrupted. And last year, with tremendous work from so many advocates, we saw some of the most significant sweeping reform in the education system in Texas in history. And so I think this session, protecting those reforms because of challenges and lost revenue in the state, are going to be critically important. So this is probably going to be one of those kind of sessions where you're playing defense. The other area, which I think is going to be so important, is the rise in need and recognition for need of mental health services. You know, it's not that mental health and resources or the need for mental health services is brand new, but it has probably been exacerbated and brought to a level across the state that we might not have recognized before. So I think destigmatizing mental health resources on one end, but also making sure that there are resources in every county across the state to address those growing needs for very young children all the way through the entire lifespan, I think are two issues that have come to light even more so in the COVID pandemic.
This is a very, very interesting issue because it cuts across the two major developments that we've been dealing with in terms of the environment in COVID, and then the racial justice demonstrations, and specifically when you think about the role of policing in our society, the most burdensome social safety net program that the police are now being called upon to provide tends to be around mental health. When there are not adequate mental health resources in a locality, all of that dealing with all of that fallout tends to come down on the police, and we look for the police to fill that role, which they are not the best trained to equip, and they're not equipped with the resources that you need to address those problems. So I totally agree with you that that is an area that is going to need substantial focus as we move forward.
With that, I know that we have limited time, and I know that we could continue this conversation, for hours, I'm sure. And it takes significant time as today. This is long-term. So I just wanted to gather any final thoughts from the panelists. If there's anything you'd like to share with our audience today before we have to close out. Anyone? Natalie?
Don't be scared of it. It's advocacy is very doable and it's very effective, and why not be a voice? I think what the recent times, COVID, the Black Lives Matter movement, all of these protests and demonstrations that we're seeing, now is the time to speak up. Your lawmakers are listening, your policymakers are listening. So if you're not going to do it now, when are you going to do it? So you might as well get involved. And then especially with the legislative session coming up, and I've been hearing just horrific rumors about budget cuts. And I think, Dan, you alluded to that earlier, but a lot of groups, a lot of social services are going to be on the chopping block. So be prepared, be ready. Get your game plan organized in advance, and hopefully everyone has a successful legislative session come January.
Yeah, no, I agree. It is not scary. Oftentimes it is a lot of fun if you are a wonk like I am. But if you step back and think of this work as relationship development, which nonprofit leaders and professionals that's your bread and butter. These are, whether you're elected official, whether it's a bureaucrat, whether it is another advocacy group, it is developing relationships and connecting those dots. So use the skills that you have. The other thing I'd say is, engage, just as Natalie said, engage the community. Advocacy is everyone's job. Civic engagement is everyone's opportunity as well as responsibility. So engage voices. Help people register to vote, from the stem to stern. It's always the time to be engaged, but I would say this year it is even more critical than ever. So, thank you to everyone in the audience for all you do, because you drive so much important work across our community and around our country. This is another way to amplify the impact of what you care about so much.
And I'll just add, we all have one collective advocacy job in the coming months. And anybody who works in nonprofits, in some way, the work that you are doing is influenced by what comes out of the census. So if you want to start with an issue right now, go figure out how the census relates to your organization and figure out what you can do to help make sure that every single person possible in North Texas is counted for the census.
So I echo all of these just phenomenal remarks. You know, I started off by saying that advocacy is everybody's business, and it is, and is even more so during times of crisis. I think it's also important to celebrate wins. I know in the CARES Act, to incentivize charitable giving, particularly for non-itemizers, there's been an expansion around charitable deductions, and I think that that's a win. And you know, as we look towards future COVID legislation, that's something that we want to continue to expand in terms of charitable giving, because there's been a decline in charitable giving since the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Along with that, there have been an increase in loans for nonprofits, and that's something, again, that we want to continue to support nonprofits through funding through this crisis, and then beyond. Because I think that, you know, we're dealing with the crisis, but, you know, what is recovery going to look like? And I think that similar to advocacy, it's very much a marathon in a lot of instances. You know, legislative victories don't happen overnight. It takes time cultivating those relationships, and oftentimes, and so you have to be willing to be in it for the long game. And something that I don't think that we mentioned, that the power of op-eds, you know, as a traditional medium to be able to elevate voices. And I think that that's another area, you know, in terms of writing letters to the editor, your op-ed, where you can advocate and have your voice be heard.
Yeah, thank you so much to all of you for sharing your wisdom and your experience with us today and our audience. And audience members, I know that we didn't get to all of your questions, but you know, you can feel free to reach out to SVP Dallas, and we'll make sure that you receive answers to those questions. And today, you know, we that it's not just involving or after the legislative advocacy at the federal and state level, but maybe also looking more, in particular, nonprofit, and working more at the local level, and how that's so important, and disseminating the accurate information about our issues that our communities are facing, so that we can maybe sway the public opinion and their and you know, really have systems change. Right now, I know that where nonprofits may feel overwhelmed and maybe vulnerable, and so we have to continue to utilize our local resources, you know, affecting change at the local and other, you know, state, federal levels, and make our voices heard. And so with that, you know, I thank all of our panelists. We learned so much from you. And I would also welcome the audience, any of you who are interested in being a part of SVP Dallas as a partner or an organization that we can help through this process. Please visit our website at www.svpdallas.org. And we would also like to thank Something Good Consulting Group once again, and also the law firm of Wright Knetzer as a sponsor for these digital gatherings. And our organization is interested in continuing or helping us continue these gatherings via Zoom. Please reach out to SVP as well. As a reminder, I'm glad Dan mentioned the census, so you know, definitely continue with filling out and encouraging others within our community to fill out the census. And I'd also like to make a reminder that Big Bang, the 2020 Equity in Action, the next 100 years is our conference up in October. And so ticket sales are opened, and you can go to www.bigbangtexas.com to learn more about the conference. It'll be a virtual conference this year, but we'll definitely have all of those amazing speakers and even a virtual marketplace. So definitely check it out, and feel free to reach out to SVP Dallas for any of those additional questions, sources, and I'm sure all the panelists are excited to share additional resources in the future as well. With that, we'd like to close our workshop today, and we look forward to seeing you at other digital gatherings in the future. Thank you.